The subcommittee will come to order. As is normal, we'll begin the hearing by reading the Oversight Committee mission statement. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, that Americans have a right to know the money Washington takes for them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold the government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have the right to know what they get from their government. We'll work tirelessly in partnership with citizens watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. This time I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. The cost of the decennial census has gone up 680% per household since 1960, and the 2010 census was almost twice as expensive per household as the 2000 census. The 2010 census reached $14.7 billion in cost. If the recent trends hold true, the 2020 census could cost the American taxpayers $25 billion or more. This is simply unacceptable. As government watchdogs, it is our job to make sure the American taxpayers' money is being used appropriately and efficiently. The purpose of today's hearing is to find ways the Bureau can achieve significant cost savings without impacting the quality and integrity of the count. The most obvious of these is adding an Internet response option to the census, which is now being offered on a nationwide basis for the American Community Survey. Without getting into the pros and cons of the community survey, it does show that technology can be better used to gather census data. We should also look at the digitalization of follow-up efforts for those who do not self-respond to the census. In fact, new technology has created an opportunity to completely redesign the model. Through the Bring Your Own Device model, the Census Bureau has the opportunity to have its temporary field staff simply download a secure application to a smartphone that not only allows them to record response information, but also has live updates with which house they should visit next, and possibly GPS data, directions, adjusting for traffic, and many other things. Collecting census data, there should be an app for that. Another issue with respect to cost savings is expanding the use of administrative records. What are the cost savings of this, and what are the privacy issues associated with intergovernmental data sharing? Administrative records do help improve data accuracy and reduce the need for multiple non-response follow-ups. A redesigned mapping project focusing on continuously tracking changes and partnering with the public and private geospatial entities and perhaps even the Postal Service could eliminate the need for nationwide cabinets in upcoming years. We also face challenges from public distrust of the government in light of recent scandals currently being investigated by the full committee. The IRS targeting of groups based on political ideology. The NSA's rampant data collection and leaks. The administration spokeswoman Susan Rice misleading the public after the Benghazi attack. All have had effects making the American public more distrustful of the government and also less likely, I believe, and based on information that's coming into my office, less likely to participate and cooperate with the government. Take Lois Lerner. She's probably costing the taxpayers money because people are fearful how their personal information revealed to the Census Service might be used against them, so they're not filling out their survey, meaning the government has to send out people to follow up with them. How will all of these affect the response rate and accuracy in 2020? Add to that the detailed and, in my opinion, intrusive questions asked on the American Community Survey, and we're facing additional challenge that potentially add costs. Finally, we must address in a cost-effective manner the question of accuracy, especially dealing with non-traditional households, the homeless, those living in the shadows, and non-English speakers. We cannot craft solutions to problems like homelessness and undocumented residents if we do not have accurate data. New cost-saving ideas are attainable, while regaining the public trust might be more difficult. A National Academy of Sciences panel has stated that a realistic goal is for the 2020 census to cost less than the 2010 census on a per-household basis. I think that's doable, and I support this goal, and I challenge the Census Bureau and the entire government to make this happen. The census coming in under budget would send a strong signal to the American people about the stewardship of their tax dollars and perhaps be a way we can regain some of the trust between the government and the governed. With this in mind, I hope this hearing starts a dialogue between the committee and the Census Bureau so that we can make the 2020 census a cost-effective success. And with that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank you for appearing before us. We'll now recognize the distinguished ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, I'd also like to congratulate Director Thompson on being confirmed as the 24th Director of the United States Census Bureau. We look forward to working with you and your staff as we continue to examine census operations. I'd like to also thank Mr. Goldenkoff and Ms. Char of the Government Accountability Office for helping this committee with its work today. Thank you. This is a critical moment for the United States Census Bureau. While the next decennial census may be 7 years away, the agency is already in the midst of researching, testing, and implementing a variety of technological and procedural reforms designed to better ensure a 2020 census that maximizes cost containment without compromising data quality. I would note that these important initiatives come on the heels of a 2010 census that, according to GAO, and as the Chairman has pointed out, was the most expensive U.S. census in history at a cost of approximately $13 billion. Now, that was a 56% increase and an $8 billion cost increase from the 2000 census. So the rate of increase is alarming. Chief among the lessons learned from the 2010 census that GAO has consistently identified as key areas for reform is the need for the Bureau to reexamine its approach to how it takes the census. In particular, 2010 witnessed the Bureau employing the same mail-out, mail-back, and door-visit census form process that it has been using since 1970, despite a population that has become increasingly demographically diverse and significantly concerned about personal privacy. If I were a cynic, I would suggest that we might shift the responsibility of the Senate over to the NSA, since they seem to be keeping track of everybody anyway. But according to GAO, this basic design of the decennial census is no longer capable of a cost-effective enumeration, and without changes, future enumerations could be fiscally unsustainable. To its credit, the Census Bureau is already making changes to reform its approach to census taking, and I am greatly encouraged by its responsiveness to the recommendations issued by GAO. Specifically, the Census Bureau is currently examining whether it could achieve meaningful cost savings by utilizing State and local agency administrative records, including driver's license and school documentation, to identify persons associated with a particular household address. In addition, the Census Bureau is researching the viability of electronic data collection and technology-receptive promotional methods, including the use of email, text messaging, and social networking sites. Moreover, the agency is testing the feasibility of using its monthly housing and population, quote, American Community Survey, close quote, data as a basis for conducting smaller and more frequent census-related tests throughout the decade in place of broader, more expensive, and one-time only tests that have defined previous decennial census-taking cycles. I would also interject that I know Mr. Chaffetz and I had discussed in the previous Congress the opportunity to utilize the United States Postal Service, because postal workers go to each and every home in America 6 days a week, and that does replicate in a way the door-to-door survey that the Census conducts, albeit we would be using existing employees who go door to door on a regular basis and might have a better feel for the number of residents in a particular household. As reported by GAO in January of this year, the various reform initiatives underway at the Census Bureau, and particularly the agency's expanding use of technology, must be accompanied by a corresponding effort to implement effective information security policies and protocols. I share the Chairman's concern regarding the current lack of comprehensive security programs at the Census Bureau that includes identified security risks, up-to-date security management program policies, meaningful information security training for Census employees, and effective incident response guidance. However, I am confident that the Bureau will continue to work with GAO to take the necessary steps to enhance its agency-wide security program and implement proper safeguards against the unauthorized use or disclosure of sensitive personal information. Additionally, I would like to note that the Census Bureau, like every other Federal agency, is already feeling the impact of sequestration and is currently operating with a budget that is 13% less than the Administration's request for 2013. Coupled with chronic underlying underfunding over the past several years, the agency is facing a variety of difficult decisions that pose a challenge to its mission, from a reduction in field tests and increased reliance on existing data to delays in planning for the 2020 decennial census and the suspension of the country's economic census. Importantly, these and other census activities are mission critical and result in data that is used to determining funding allocations for community services, infrastructure, and neighborhood improvements, as well as public health and educational program and forecasting economic and employment conditions. These efforts are essential to our national economy and policymaking, and I would urge my colleagues to keep the importance of the Census Bureau's mission in mind as we continue to examine census operations. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to the discussion. These and other issues will come up today with today's witnesses. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. Our other members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. We will now introduce and recognize our panel. The Honorable John Thompson is the Director of the United States Census Bureau. I add my congratulations as well on your confirmation. Mr. Robert Goldenoff is the Director of Strategic Issues Group at the U.S. Government Accountability Office. And our technical expert here is Carol Shaw. She is the Director of IT Group at the United States Government Accountability Office. Welcome. Pursuant to the committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Will you all please stand up and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You all may be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, we particularly like to ask our questions up here and feel like we get the information we are most interested in. We would ask that you would limit yourself to around 5 minutes with your statement. We have in the record, and hopefully everybody up here has reviewed the written material that was provided to us. So if you would limit yourself to 5 minutes, we have got a little traffic light system in front of you. The green light means you are good to go. The yellow light means you are running out of time, so hurry up. And the red light means stop. There will be no tickets issued, but I will start looking sternly at you when the red light comes on. So we will get underway. We will now start with Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to have the opportunity to appear today before the subcommittee to discuss 2020 census operations. I will make a brief statement. I will ask that my full statement be added for the record. Let me also say that I am delighted to return to the Census Bureau as Director, and I am looking forward to working with the committee. A democracy needs credible, objective, and timely information, and the decennial census is one of the important sources of this information. The 2020 census will continue this tradition, but as with each census, we must consider new opportunities with respect to information technology. I believe current planning activities will support a census that is significantly less costly and will deliver faster results than the 2010 census. I can pledge the best efforts of the dedicated public servants of the agency, but we must also ask the Congress for its support to ensure the Census Bureau can face these challenges. Among the most promising options we are researching to accomplish our goals are, first, reengineering the field data collection operations; second, making better use of information previously collected by Federal and State agencies; third, using the Internet as the primary self-response option; and fourth, drawing on geographic tools and data sets to eliminate the need to physically canvass large portions of the United States. One of the major opportunities to reduce costs lies with applying operations research methods to work management and route planning. We are exploring techniques to take advantage of automation to conduct our field work more efficiently, including routing our interviewers, accounting for optimum times to visit, tracking travel distances and traffic, and other factors to minimize extensive travel and wasted visits. We are also exploring adaptive design techniques that will help us apply statistical methodology to do our work smarter. The objective of this effort is to re-engineer our field management processes, thereby reducing both the hours that our interviewers will spend on collecting the data from households that do not take advantage of the self-response option, and reducing the infrastructure required to support these efforts. In addition to our efforts to re-engineer the field data collection, we are looking at other alternatives to reduce the non-response follow-up workload. One of the promising innovations is the use of data people have already given to the government to enumerate households that do not return Census questionnaires. These data range from information about vacant units collected by the U.S. Postal Service to information that is collected by various Federal and State agencies to administer and support the programs. We also have important opportunities to reduce the non-response follow-up workload by improving self-response. The traditional way of responding through the mail, then following up through an interview, is inefficient. The Internet, in contrast, is becoming an increasingly important tool for self-response. For the 2020 Census, the Census Bureau is actively testing strategies to encourage and motivate the use of the Internet as the primary response option. The Geographic Support Services Initiative at the Census Bureau is directed at obtaining the highest quality address and geospatial data. We are looking to expand partnerships with tribal, state, and local governments, as well as with the private sector. These partnerships will be critical in allowing the Census Bureau to develop a more focused address canvassing program that will allow the Census Bureau to avoid recanvassing large areas of the country for which there are no changes or for which information can be obtained from an alternative source. Finally, I would like to note that all these options are buttressed by the Census Bureau's efforts to more effectively integrate IT services and systems. Instead of building different IT systems that serve single programs or even single census operations, we are building systems to share across the enterprise. We have also virtualized our servers, building a private cloud environment, which we are using to deliver a virtual desktop infrastructure, or VDI, that allows us to decouple a user's device from any sensitive data. This capability allows us to dramatically increase our telework program. Now employees can use their devices, and we do not need to furnish equipment. We believe this capacity puts us in a strong footing to consider Bring Your Own Device, or BYOD, as a real possibility for the 2020 Census. In the 2010 Census, we used a custom-built mobile device and custom-built software to run on that device. Now we have a team working not only on the technological considerations and security requirements, but also the personnel policies that would have to accompany a BYOD approach for 2020 based on utilization of off-the-shelf technology and software. Finally, the budget requested for FY 2014 includes an increase of $150.7 million for the 2020 Census. The Census Bureau will need this to conduct the necessary research and testing efforts to prepare for 2020 at this point. The work in fiscal 2014 is critical to meet our schedule to produce and analyze data in time for key decision-making. The next 2 years represent an extremely critical period in the 2020 planning development cycle. We cannot delay the work to begin developing our major systems in fiscal year 2016. Therefore, our preparations for this effort over the next 2 fiscal years are of the highest priority. To meet these challenges will require the best efforts of the Census Bureau, and we are looking forward to working with the Congress so they can provide the support to meet these challenges successfully. Thank you very much, and I would be happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Before we go on to Mr. Golenkopf, I see the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney, has joined us. She is not officially a member of this subcommittee, so at this point I'd like to ask unanimous consent that she be authorized to participate in this hearing. Without objection, so ordered. We do have 2 other speakers at the table. It's my understanding that on behalf of the GAO, Mr. Golenkopf will speak, and Ms. Cha is here because they realize some of us up here are tech geeks and might want to get in a little more into the weeds than might otherwise happen. So at this point, we'll recognize Mr. Golenkopf from the GAO.
Thank you. Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the subcommittee, appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss the progress the Census Bureau is making in controlling the cost of the 2020 enumeration. As you well know, the fundamental challenge facing the Census Bureau is how to cost-effectively count a population that is growing steadily larger, more diverse, increasingly difficult to find, and less willing to participate in the decennial. The cost of counting each housing unit is no longer fiscally sustainable. In 2010 dollars, the Bureau spent around $16 to enumerate each housing unit in 1970, compared to $98 in 2010. Much like running up a down escalator, with each decade, the Bureau has had to invest substantially more resources simply to match the results of previous enumerations. In our past work, we noted that to control costs while maintaining accuracy, actions were needed in at least 3 areas. First, the Bureau needs to transform itself into a high-performing organization. Second, the Bureau needs to re-engineer key census-taking operations. And third, the Bureau needs to strengthen its IT management and security practices. Joining me this morning, as was already mentioned, is Carol Cha, Director of GAO's IT Acquisition Management Team. And our remarks will focus on the status of the cost containment initiatives within each of those 3 areas. Specifically, we will highlight the progress the Bureau has made to date and what still needs to be done going forward. I would also like to take this opportunity to welcome John Thompson back to the Census Bureau as its newest Chief Executive and wish him every success going forward. John's experience both inside and outside of the Bureau, combined with the new 5-year fixed term of office for the Census Director, should help provide the expertise and continuity of leadership that will be important for keeping decennial preparations on track in the years ahead. Overall, we found that the Bureau's plans for controlling enumeration costs show promise if effectively implemented. At the same time, the Bureau's plans contain a number of open questions that will need to be addressed for a successful headcount in 2020. For example, in the area of organizational transformation, the Bureau is restructuring its entire decennial directorate in order to improve collaboration and communication across its divisions, improve operational efficiencies, and instill a more innovative culture. The Bureau is also developing agency-wide standards, guidance, and tools in such areas as risk management and IT investment to reduce duplicative efforts across the Bureau. These and other actions the Bureau has taken are all important steps forward. However, several initiatives require additional attention. For example, in response to our recommendations, the Bureau has created a cost estimation team reporting to the Director and recently hired an individual to lead that group. Going forward, it will be important for the Bureau to finalize its cost estimating policies, procedures, and guidance as we have already recommended in order to develop reliable cost estimates for 2020. With respect to re-engineering key census-taking activities, the Bureau is researching a number of operational changes that may yield significant savings. As John already mentioned, key among these are using the Internet as a self-response option and replacing certain enumerator-collected data with administrative records. To be sure, the new census-taking methods the Bureau is considering have the potential to reduce costs. As one example, the Bureau estimates that administrative records could save up to $2 billion by reducing the need for certain labor-intensive door-to-door visits by census workers. However, the Bureau has never used these methods at the scale needed for the decennial, if at all, which entails a degree of operational risk. Thus, as the countdown to 2020 continues, it will be important for the Bureau to effectively design, test, and implement these new approaches on schedule with an eye toward ensuring they will generate the needed cost savings, function in concert with other census operations, and work at the scale needed for the national headcount. I will now turn to my colleague, Carol, who will discuss the Bureau's progress in strengthening IT management and security practices.
Chairman Farenthold, Ranking Member Lynch, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting us to testify today. The Bureau currently has a number of research and testing activities that are underway and plans to use those results to select the IT investments to support the 2020. The technology options being explored collectively represent a dramatic leap from 2010, and thus a greater amount of risk for the Bureau. And at this time, the Bureau has not yet achieved the level of institutional maturity needed to reliably bring these solutions to bear. Accordingly, we have recently initiated work to evaluate the status and plans for the various IT options, which include, as Robert had mentioned, the use of the Internet, a possible use of a bring-your-own-device model, or BYOD, to enable enumerators to use their own smartphones or other mobile devices to perform field data collection and other activities, as well as the implementation of enterprise-wide IT services, such as delivering Bureau-wide storage, servers, and communication services via the cloud in an effort to improve scalability and reduce complexity. And while these options offer the potential for greater efficiency and effectiveness, that potential is dependent in large part on the Bureau's having well-established IT management and security controls. IT controls that, if effectively implemented, significantly enhance the ability to deliver these solutions within cost, schedule, and performance targets, as well as to ensure the protection of the information that they contain. Our work on the 2010 census highlighted the mismanagement, major cost, schedule, and performance issues associated with the acquisition of several critical IT investments. Many of these problems were caused by weaknesses in IT governance, requirements management, and IT workforce planning. For example, in the case of the FIDCA handheld computers, functional requirements increased by thousands due in part to a lack of a robust requirements process. Additionally, our work earlier this year on the Bureau's IT security posture showed that while the Bureau had taken steps to safeguard the information and systems that support its mission, it had not effectively implemented appropriate access controls to protect those systems from intrusion. Accordingly, we have made numerous recommendations aimed at strengthening and improving the Bureau's IT management and security capacity. To the Bureau's credit, it has made measurable progress to address the areas of IT governance and security. However, more work remains. It will be critical for the Bureau to stay aggressive in its push to fully implement our remaining open recommendations. By doing so, the Bureau will be better positioned to deliver its planned IT solutions in a predictable and consistent manner, and to ensure the adequate protection of these systems. In summary, on behalf of Robert and myself, the Bureau is making progress along a number of fronts to secure a more cost-effective enumeration, with efforts aimed at transforming the organization, improving the cost-effectiveness of census-taking methods, as well as strengthening its IT practices. However, a high degree of risk and uncertainty exists, and it will be critical for the Bureau to further define its roadmap for 2020 and to set clear executive-level decision points to improve its ability to manage those risks as well as achieve desired outcomes. In addition, your continued oversight will also remain vital to help ensure that the Bureau is on path to a more efficient census. Thank you, and we look forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you very much, and I'll take the first stab at it, recognizing myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Thompson, the number we hear is $16 per household. I assume the typical suburban or urban household is not your problem in that dollar amount. I got my census form in 2010, filled it out, and mailed it back. I couldn't have cost $16. Where are your high dollar problems, and do you have any specific thoughts on how you address those?
I do, Congressman. A lot of the cost in the census is built up in the infrastructure required to collect the information from respondents that, not like you, don't respond and are very difficult to get to respond. So to the degree that we can reduce that infrastructure by using some of the operations research methods, by using administrative records, as you suggested before, that's where we're going to really reduce the cost. And then we can apply some additional methods to make the way that the interviewers work more efficient and effective.
Now, is the $16 a current number, or wasn't 2010 substantially higher than that? Do you know?
My good colleague here who estimated the cost, it was much higher.
It was $100. It was about $98 per housing unit.
So it's close to $100 on the last census, when historically it's been more like 16.
Okay, that's the average overall.
Yeah.
It's been going up every single decade.
Okay. Is your microphone on?
It was $100 on average per housing unit in 2010, and I think that was up from around $70 per housing unit in 2000.
Okay.
So,
All right, well, let's talk. You're talking a little bit about technology. I'm happy to see you brought a laptop, Mr. Thompson. Maybe you're atypical of the government that doesn't seem to be able to compute its way out of a paper bag. You're talking about a cloud-based system. Are you developing your own cloud-based system, or are you outsourcing to a private company that has an existing cloud infrastructure?
Right now, we are building our own cloud system, but we are in consultation with private sector experts to build that. Right now, we have to build our own because we believe that is the best way to maintain the security of the census information.
And okay, so that brings up my next question, actually, is with respect to security. As you talk about using other records that the government has to ease your job, that creates a level of information sharing between agencies, and the obvious technical and privacy issues associated with that. In light of the information that is leaking out from Mr. Snowden at the NSA, how are we opening a can of worms there with respect to privacy that we need to be worried about? And do you feel you can access that data from other agencies without specific congressional authorization?
Those are certainly good points. So let me start by saying that we are actively researching the use of administrative records to improve the census. We will take in information from other agencies. We give no information back out of the Census Bureau. Once we have the information, we protect it internally, and nothing leaves the Bureau.
That's what the NSA thought, too.
Well, let me also say that you mentioned security issues, and security is, I think, is one of the most important issues in assuring the public that their information is confidential. And that's one of the reasons I was really glad to see when I came on that the GAO was looking at the Bureau's IT security. IT security is an ongoing challenge.
So I'm kind of short on time. So do you feel like you're going to need congressional authorization to do some of this stuff? Yes or no?
I think we'll need the help of the Congress in some instances.
All right, and let me go to Ms. Chaw for a second on a technical issue. We hear a lot of discussion about needing to gear up now, but in terms of Internet time, if we're looking at a do-it-yourself, how much of this work can we do now? How much do we have to wait until we're a little closer because we don't know what devices are going to be in vogue or what new technology will be developing in that time frame?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Bureau is undertaking a number of exploratory measures to look at what technology is available. I think what's important to be mindful of is that the Bureau focus on institutionalizing those IT management and security controls at this time in order to be in a position to effectively deliver those solutions. My understanding from Director Thompson is that the current plan is to start the development planning work for systems.
And do you agree with, I'm sorry,
FY16.
do you agree with Director Thompson that an in-house system is necessary and as cost-effective as, saying, outsourcing to Amazon or Rackspace or some company like that for the cloud services that already has a big infrastructure in place?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we haven't done the work associated with that, so it's hard for me to say. Once we get that information and get a clearer sense of the roadmap that they intend to craft, we'll be in a better position to comment.
Yeah, I just worry about large capital expenditures in a high-tech area that changes for census that is done once every 10 years. I've already gone a little bit over my time, so in fairness, I will recognize Mr. Lynch for 6 minutes and 17 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I'll need that. But I do want to ask the impact of sequestration. I realize that you do work over the 10-year census period to get us to a point that we deliver the census at the end of that period as accurately as possible. And I know in March of 2013, we got a letter from Secretary of Commerce Rebecca Blank, who warned that she was acting secretary, actually. She warned that sequestration could, and I want to quote from her letter, she said, it could force the agency to delay the economic census, which is the once every 5-year survey that forms the basis for a wide range of economic indicators from GDP to unemployment rates. Sequestration also could force the Bureau to conduct fewer field tests and increase the reliance on existing data and delay evaluation programs and operational design decisions until 2015. Census advocates also say that the budget cuts will lead to a less informed government and create a more expensive 2020 enumeration and endanger data that business, researchers, and State and local governments utilize. So let me ask you, Director Thompson, do you agree with the advocates that the across-the-board cuts to the census can yield some damaging and negative results that can affect not only the government policymaking but also economic decision-making in the private sector?
Congressman, I do agree with that. The Bureau, because of the limitations in 2013, had to move several tests back to 2014. These included testing adaptive design methodologies, which are statistical ways to make the non-response follow-up more efficient, as well as ways to minimize the number of visits that you would make to households and to test administrative records and reducing the workloads. That's been moved back to 2014. Also, some of the products on the economic census have actually been delayed. So 2014 is a critical year, and without adequate funding, we'd be forced to make decisions between what to do, what not to do. These would involve the tests I just mentioned. It could also involve tests that would allow us to reduce, to reach our goal of doing a targeted canvassing. So funding for the Census Bureau in this time is very critical.
All right. I understand to accommodate some of these sequestration effects, the Bureau discussed reducing contract work and discussed not filling vacancies that are being created through attrition. Can you further describe the Bureau's plan to address those type of cuts and reductions going forward?
Well, I could, but I think it would take a long time at the hearing as we went over the various scenarios that could.
Well, let's talk about the trend.
But in a general sense, as I said before, the big issue would be, without the adequate funding, we would be in a position where we would be deciding what research and development to do for 2020 and what research and development not to do. And 2016 is a key year for us to begin developing the systems for the 2020 census, and we would be developing those systems without as much information as we would use. We would not be building in the cost-saving methods that we would. So we're putting the program more and more at risk by pushing things further into the decade.
Let me ask you, I know from my own experience that especially with phone lines, fewer and fewer people have phone lines, and I know that the traditional way has been to call in, follow up, but now place is less important. No one's, I mean, we have one because we just don't get rid of it. But a lot of people don't have phone lines anymore, and so place, address is less important to the American consumer. Are you having trouble with that, or have you developed a way of dealing with that doesn't reduce your accuracy in terms of tracking people?
Yeah, this is another topic we could talk about for a long time, because I used to deal with this with my previous company that I worked at. We did the biggest telephone survey for the Federal Government.
Were you with the CIA?
No, this was the scientific survey. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
But these are really important issues, because cell phones, as you say, are not address based. So you have to do more probing interviews to determine where residence is, and there are ways you can do this. They're more expensive. You also can't use auto dialing techniques to call cell phones because they're protected under various acts. So that makes it more expensive too. But they're There's methodology to deal with it. It's just more expensive and more time-consuming, and the response for dialing cell phones is lower than for landlines.
Yeah. Okay. With the remaining time, if I could ask representatives from GAO, do you see what the implications could be for the Census by way of the sequestration cuts?
Yeah, it's the sequestration cuts themselves, as well as uncertainty in funding that comes from a continuing resolution, and a lot of this is congressional policy, so I don't want to weigh in there. But the fact is that the Census Bureau has essentially scrapped its old approach for taking the census, some of these tried and true methods, and it's trying something new for 2020. And so past experience has shown that upfront research and testing, these early investments in research and testing, are critical to stave off cost increases down the road. So to the extent that budget cuts and uncertainty in funding forces the Bureau to put off a lot of the decisions and testing into the future, it just puts the entire operation at risk.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. At this time, we'll recognize the Vice Chair, Mr. Walberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. Certainly around census time, probably one of the greatest glut of emails, phone calls, letters, contacts we receive is about why. Why does the census do this to us, and specifically about questions. But let me go back to a train of questioning the Chairman began to some degree, and that's on the historic cost, $16 per household, and you've indicated that that has been growing consistently over the time, and this past being $100 per household. What's the driving force behind, Mr. Thompson, the cost as you see it, and then Mr. Goldenkopf, I want to ask you the same. What's the driving cost behind that consistent increase in the cost per household?
Let me take this from a couple of perspectives. In some censuses, the 2000 census, which I was intimately involved in, a big component of the increase in costs was a lack of agreement on the design until late in the game. And if you couple that, late in the decade, and if you couple that with the growing pressures on the Census Bureau to count everyone as accurately as possible, or to count the population very accuracy, that's driving the cost up. For the 2010 census, looking at that, there are forces on the Census Bureau to provide an accurate count. The population is becoming much more diverse. And the big problem is, at least in my view, was that the Bureau was using methods to do this, to try to produce this count, that were essentially generated in 1970. And as Mr. Goldenkopf said, as previous Director Groves says, those methods are unsustainable for taking censuses in the future. So it's a combination of the population becoming much more complex, much more diverse, pressures on the Census Bureau to produce extremely accurate data, and using methods that are no longer up to the task.
Mr. Goldenkopf, your response.
Those are all accurate statements and things that GAO has said in years past. Basically, as the population has become more diverse, the Census Bureau has to conduct more operations to ensure everyone is counted accurately. You have people living in basements and converted attics, in sheds, in backyards, people living in cars. If everybody filled out their census form when they received it, the Census Bureau could do a very cost-effective census, but of course they don't. And it's the field operations, it's the constant follow-up operation, a lot of redundant operations that are needed that if you don't catch someone in one operation, you'll get them in a second operation, or a third, or a fourth. So everything that John has said is true, but I'll add one more aspect to this. It's all well and good to have these redundant operations, but what I think the Bureau needs to do a better job of is determining the return on investment of each one of those census-taking operations. For example, to develop an accurate address list, something in the neighborhood of around a dozen separate operations were used. Some of those add accuracy. Some of those actually may create more noise.
Just jumping in there with the lists and maps as well, would the private sector be able to accomplish an assist for us at a far more accurate and reduced cost simply because we know there are lists out there? I mean,
well, yes and no. I mean, first of all, probably the most accurate list in terms of where mailboxes are located comes from the Postal Service, and the Bureau is already using that. Where the challenge comes in is the people who live in unconventional housing units, and that's where some amount of where the address canvassing comes in, where the Bureau goes door to door looking for clues that people might be living in a basement or in an attic or in the shed in the backyard or possibly in a car. There are homeless people out there. People are very mobile. So it's really not clear if the private sector has a better address list.
are we asking too much? Our questioning process, are we obtaining a greater amount of information than really is required? Is that part of the cost?
Well,
Mr. Thompson.
I believe that the information we collect on the decennial census is extremely critical, and I could go over the uses of it. It's used for basically enforcing civil rights. It's used for redistricting purposes. I will also say that we provide that information, the topics in the 7-year to the Congress, and then we provide the actual questions in the 8-year to make sure that we are in agreement with the Congress before we take the census on the content of it.
Well, I guess that's again a great concern of my constituents and many people, that we are committing acts of intrusion beyond what seems to be necessary to people. And of course, when we're talking about costs, I think it's a question that ought to be addressed as well. Are we collecting absolutely necessary information? Are we going overboard in certain cases? And are we providing information that actually gives help? So I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Ms. Maloney for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Mr. Thompson, on your new role as Director of the Census Bureau. I was very pleased to have sent a letter supporting your nomination during Senate confirmations, and I was very pleased that Congress last year passed legislation that included a provision that I had authored under separate legislation for a long time that makes the Director of the Census a presidential term appointment of 5 years, subject to the confirmation of the Senate. And this is very important so that the Director is tied to the needs of the census and not to an election calendar. And I agree with your testimony today that credible, objective, and timely data on population growth is fundamental to a democracy, incredibly important for fair representation and fair distribution of hundreds of billions of dollars in Federal aid. And your testimony today on the escalating cost, now up to roughly $100 a survey, I'm really pleased to hear that you're looking at new initiatives to cut those costs, including using the Internet as a self-response option and replacing the door-to-door collection with administrative records under certain circumstances. But relying on the Internet, it potentially could save a great deal of money, but not everyone has access to an Internet, and people don't know how to use it, particularly the elderly and certain populations. So is there a risk of an undercount in specific populations as we rely or move to relying on an Internet response?
Well, Congressman, you're hitting a very important point in terms of how we have to take the census in the United States. That is, there is no one method that will be the right method for each segment of our diverse population. The Internet is a vehicle that can be used to enumerate a large part of our population, in my opinion, and it will result in a lot of resource savings. That doesn't mean we're going to do away with the mail for everyone, or we're going to not have to go visit them and talk to them with with interviewers that speak in language or various other methods. But we have to realize that if we can make savings in one area, we can use those savings to target methods to make sure that every part of our diverse population is counted.
And what's the update on these operations? Do you have a lesson plan or a plan of how you're going to use the Internet that's been produced, and are you putting that into effect, or where does it stand?
So right now, we are in the process of doing research on a small scale that's aimed at how we can motivate a response to the Internet. We're looking at some various other options, which would include a pre-registration, so people might sign up in advance to do the census. But we're in the beginning stages of doing that work, and that's what we really need to focus on that if we're going to be able to, and get the funding to do it.
Okay. Can you elaborate on your testimony on the $2 billion projected savings if you use administrative records in 2020 to reduce the door-to-door? And exactly how would that work? And certainly saving money is necessary, but are there risks to increasing your reliance on administrative records? And what can you do about those records? And what particular types of records would the Bureau seek? Who would have access to these records? And what type of information would the Bureau seek to verify on relying on administrative records?
Well, I think the $2 billion figure was mentioned by Robert, and I needed to get straight with him on exactly where it came from. But I would stipulate that there are significant savings to be realized by using administrative records. And the Census Bureau we have used administrative records before on a small scale, as was noted. We've used Postal Service records. We've used military records to count the military overseas. And the Secretary of Commerce has really broad discretion in acquiring administrative records, working with other agencies. The big thing is, one of the big things is deciding on some issues as to, would you use administrative records in lieu of at least trying one contact on non-response follow-up? That's something that we need to talk about, need to really understand and get widespread buy-in on as to whether that would be acceptable. That would probably offer the greatest savings. There are other options for using administrative records. I will say that when the Census Bureau gets records from anywhere, the Postal Service, any source of administrative records, we keep those records confidential. We do not give information back out of the Census Bureau. In fact, within the Census Bureau, only those individuals that need to actually access the records have access to them, and to the extent we can, we take identifying information off of the records. We have used records in our research so far from a variety of sources, from HUD, from the Social Security, the Indian Health Service, the CMS. We are looking to really work with the Congress to get endorsement that this is the right methodology, that there is support for this methodology throughout the decade.
Thank you very much. We will now go to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This being new from this position and looking at this first time, as I've started digging this with my committee and the committee side, but also my staff, this is an interesting area that often gets overlooked with all the headlines and everything else of the world. And as I made a statement during August, I said it's a lot of times the big stuff will take care of the big stuff, but it's the things like this that really matter to people, because it's amazing how many questions we get on this and how many issues, and especially from a cost perspective. I want to ask some questions that sort of, not random, but sort of rapid fire, and then some that will end just from my own case. Mr. Goldkopf, you had said that people are less willing to participate. I'm going to come back to that statement here in just a moment, but I have a question that I just haven't found. What is the percent of non-response follow-up? What is the percent of those who, Mr. Thompson, anybody wants to answer this real quickly?
In 2010, the response rate was in the low 60%, I believe. Which
So
was
60% did it the normal, proper way. They get the envelope in the mail, they respond, they turn it back in, and
exactly. It was like 60 plus, not like some was 63. So some would be.
You have a nice chart in your prepared statement.
Yeah, I do.
and I just missed the number. Out of curiosity, out of that,
63.
just curious, and because a question was just raised on the internet.
Pardon?
What is the highest percentage of demographics that actually turn it in the proper way? Age demographics.
So the characteristics of those that don't return the questionnaire.
No, I want to know the ones who do.
That don't return the questionnaire tend to be more minority, more.
No, I want to know those who do.
They tend to be more non-minority, more owner than renter.
Elderly, senior adult, 45 and over, 55 and over, 65 and over. Because I have a purpose to the question. I'm not trying to lead you down a rabbit hole here.
I believe in the research that I've done that the elderly do respond at a higher rate than the young.
Because one of the concerns is if we use the internet, the elderly will be disenfranchised, and they're returning it on the proper rate anyway. They tend to be more responsive to this. And that's why I was not trying to be tricky. I was just trying to, as we look at the honest answers here and looking at it as we go forward.
Just like the internet is just an additional method. It's not that the other methods are being tossed. It's just one more method that people can use, one more option.
But many times when this conversation comes up, this comes up in a lot of other areas that we're undercounting, we're doing these kind of things based on, and so I just wanted to get that out there. I want to follow up also. I wish I had far more time than this, but we'll get into, I'm sure, more. Ms. Chairman, we'll get this. I want to go back to one that we get a lot, and it's balancing privacy and effectiveness, and especially in the ACS. This is where we get a lot of questions, and I'll follow up on the Congressman Walberg's question as well. Are we asking, too much? And I think I'm interested in what you said, that you're going to bring the questions to Congress, that we see these. Does that come in the form of legislation, or is that just merely informational?
We submit the questions to the Congress. If the Congress wants to take action, they would have to enact legislation.
Okay. So you just bring it as informational purposes, and if there was need to be changed, then, okay. Thank you for that.
Mr. Collins, on the ACS, those questions, at least initially, it evolved from the census long form.
It did.
They were tied to legislation.
Oh, I get it. But most people don't know we're not using the long form anymore. We're using the short form. We're taking it more, frequently. And these are questions that come in, and then, of course, you get into the, as you said earlier, less willing to participate. And especially in this environment that we're currently in, which will probably get not a lot better as far as people trusting the government and trusting the information to be held. These are the kind of questions we get in our office all the time. And, one of the issues that, given the public's increased skepticism here, I think we've got to do a better job of how we, ask the questions, and if are we all properly asking, and then also doing away or de-emphasizing, because I've looked into this, there's been one prosecution for not turning in your census data. Yet we have it on there, and it is in law, and I understand that, and the threat is if you don't turn this in, we're going to prosecute you. I think a little less emphasis on that when people call, it would probably help a great deal, because the next thing they do is they call my office and says, I'm not sending this stuff in, they don't need to know this, or they're going to prosecute me. So maybe more of a thought than anything else. The questions that come from there, however, as we do this, the ability to save money, the ability to look at this, I'm very concerned as a chairman is that we're developing software, we're developing the platform process now that could really be outdated in 6 to 7, 6 years, 7 years as we start again. What's the thought process that went into that? Not just laying groundwork, as you said, but I'm concerned that even the answers you get now may be outdated even in 2 or 3 years. So what is being taken into account there?
Well, I can't speak on the Bureau's behalf, but I can tell you that high-performing organizations, what they do is they typically have an internal team that is tasked with looking at and keeping up with the key technological trends and to anticipate and identify those disruptive technologies that may affect their core business, and then develop options for actually implementing them into their business. So, and that's occurring in both the Federal and the private sector space. So as just one example, in the Federal sector, when you look at the Department of Transportation, they do have certain major programs, for example, that have a technology scan and assessment group that, for example, looks at technology options for deploying things such as connected vehicles, for example. So those things are occurring, but I think Director Thompson would be in a better position to to talk about what they're doing to ensure that they stay abreast of the current.
We can, and Mr. Chairman, we'll come back to that, but I think this is the question, because before this committee in particular, we hear more problems, and I think Mr. Chairman would agree, and the ranking member as well, we hear more concerns on IT mismanagement and expenses almost than any other thing that we do. And so it's really concerning to me when I say we're going to build our own system. So I refer back to the Chairman, and we'll continue on.
Thank you very much. You know, so the Lord works in mysterious ways. Mr. Collins brought up the American Community Survey. I realize this committee had a hearing on that last year. But oddly enough, guess what I got in the mail last month? Guess what phone call I got last week? Very threatening nature, by the way, because I had not yet filled it out because I'd wanted to go through this hearing first. I do think at some point we will review that, and I expect Mr. Collins and I would love to visit with you specifically about that. And if we determine that everything wasn't covered last year, we may jump into that again. It may be time to review what we are asking. You know, when you're asked questions like what your mortgage is, how much your electric bill is. I mean, I understand some of the purposes of these and the committees that would want them, but it's not raised well to the American people, and it's an issue that I get a lot. That's obviously out of scope of this hearing. We were talking about costs, but I do think it remains an issue that a lot of our constituents are concerned about. So let me go on with a couple of questions. We talked a little bit, Mr. Thompson, and actually I'm going to take this to the GAO because this was before your time. The electronic slate program that we paid to develop custom hardware and software for the enumerators last time around in 2010. It's my understanding that never really worked beyond them being able to enter their time. From a practical purposes, they weren't able to put a lot of data in that. Is that consistent with your findings, or have you investigated the success of that at all?
Well, you know, in looking at the major systems that were acquired for 2010, that does seem to be consistent. So, for example, with the FITCA handheld computers, which was custom developed hardware and software, you know, ultimately the Bureau delivered a half-baked solution that, you know, ran into significant cost overruns, and ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, required that manual workaround in order to meet the immutable 2010 deadline, and that ultimately led to a $3 billion increase to the ultimate cost.
And I commend that mistake to you, Mr. Thompson, and Ms. Cha, as a consideration with respect to really something cloud-based and less done in-house. You know, computer technology doesn't have a 10-year lifespan. Technology changes so quickly that you really are potentially buying a computer system that will be used for one census, when maybe renting something through a cloud service might be worth looking at. You talked a little bit about statistical methodology. There's no proposal in your statistical methodology that does away with, we're going to try to count everyone. We're not going to make assumptions like, you know, when somebody does a phone poll of X number of you know, likely voters, they extrapolate the whole country. We really are going to try to do what the Constitution requires. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly, Congressman. I was very clear in my confirmation hearing about that, is that that's not a technique that I think is appropriate for taking the decennial census.
All right. And then with respect, you also talked about changing methodology with respect to how you get hold of non-responders. What do you see as your number one or number two failures in areas, and how do you, you know, groups meet to reach, you know, people who live in cars or undocumented residents? I mean, where are your big failures, and what are your top one or two ideas for addressing that?
So our research has showed that the people that are less likely to be counted or harder to count tend to be a minority. They tend to be highly mobile. They tend to be maybe more renters and in unusual living situations. So the effort has to be, and it's more expensive to count those individuals. So my goal is to find ways to count the big part of the population which is relatively easier to count, a lot more cost effectively, thereby freeing up resources that we can then target to counting.
So at some point, I would like to get from you, and if you could maybe do that in writing based on time considerations, what you consider to be your top 5 counting problems and your top 5 proposed solutions. And they may not necessarily jibe. It's kind of an 80-20 rule. You might be able to. Your solutions might be for a problem that's a little further down the line, but it's an easier solution. But I want to see what your biggies are and what you're going to. And can you tell me a little bit about you're spending a lot of time and effort on geospatial data. There's a lot of that already out there, and it doesn't change that much. Obviously you get new houses built, but they don't move. At what point are we doing something that there's no longer a need for, that there's such a marketplace for with GPSs in everybody's cars and the prevalence of Google Maps? At what point is this geospatial data collected and maintained by the government a worthwhile deal, or something that, oh, private sector has taken it over, we've seeded it, and it's done?
Well, you are talking about something that's very dear to my heart in terms of targeted canvassing. That is, we don't have to build everything. We don't have to. We can buy it. We can get it off the Internet. We can work with private companies. We don't have to do it all ourselves, and that's why it's exciting now to look to form partnerships with the private sector to get information that will. I'm stumbling. I'm sorry. That will allow us to not have to canvass all of the country.
Okay. And finally, I hope Mr. Lynch will explore some of the postal. He mentioned in his opening statement the possibility nobody knows the area better than the postal worker who walks it every day. I think there's a huge opportunity for that, understanding that postal workers are paid a lot more than census workers, so we've got to factor that into the cost-wise equation. But I know Mr. Lynch brought it up. I'll give him, if he doesn't ask the question, I will. And then finally, my last question is, you mentioned the need for congressional action with respect to possibly authorizing sharing of data, and Mr. Collins brought up the possibility of amending the questions both on the short form census and the American Community Survey. Can you the sooner we do that, the better, I think, in your preparing. At some point, could you also let us send a letter to this committee with some of the changes that you think you would like to see in legislation, because we actually probably move slower than you do. So with that, I'll recognize Mr. Lynch for a second round of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will follow up on that point. Back in September 2011, GAO recommended that the Secretary of Commerce and the United States Postal Service consider a couple of things. One, expanding their current collaborative efforts to include recruiting mail carriers or retired mail carriers for the 2020 census. And the second thing that they talked about was assessing whether strategies can be developed to reduce undeliverable as addressed mail in the census. So, Mr. Goldenkoff, you want to take a crack at this and just see where we are and what those. I did read the GAO report, but I want to get this on the record. Where are we with those efforts of collaboration?
Well, they're ongoing, is my understanding. As was already mentioned, the partnerships that the Bureau wants to form for the geospatial data, the GSSI, which will allow for a rolling updating of the address list throughout the decade instead of doing it in the 2 years before the census, basically taking one large bite all at once. You do it in smaller increments, and that will be very helpful for targeted address canvassing. There are other opportunities for collaboration with the Postal Service that the Bureau will need to explore, particularly as it gets several years down the road. For example, of the roughly 600,000 enumerators that were hired to do non-response follow-up, only 2,400 were postal workers. And if the Bureau had perhaps done a more targeted approach to actually targeted recruitment of postal workers, they could have gotten a lot more. And as you said, these are people who know the neighborhoods. They know how to deliver stuff. This is what they do for a living. They know the complexities of the different neighborhoods. They already have the background checks done. So that's an option there as well. Use of postal facilities that the Postal Service doesn't need. The Postal Service has a lot of extra space. Perhaps the Census Bureau can use some of those for their local census offices. So there might be some opportunities there as well.
Right. I know that in the GAO report that I read, it had a dollar figure of $41 an hour for an urban postal worker. Excuse me, an urban mail carrier, a letter carrier, and I think it was $34 for a rural letter carrier. But the retirees obviously would be a lesser cost. They've already got their pension. They've already got retiree health benefits. I'm just curious if, in looking, the Postal Service has already put out several early retirement programs, incentives to get postal workers to retire. Many of those workers have expressed a desire to continue working part-time or in some capacity. This might offer us an opportunity, if we work through the postal workers with their unions, to actually recruit some of those postal workers, letter carriers that might want to supplement their income, but they wouldn't have the full range of benefits that an active letter carrier currently requires.
And that's where the trade-offs need to be taken into account, the cost-benefit. You mentioned the hourly wage rates for the mail carriers of $34 and $41, depending if they were rural or urban. That compares with $15 per hour on average for a census enumerator. So you see there's a huge cost difference. And to the extent that some enumeration takes place on the evenings, on weekends, postal workers, I guess, would be making additional money for overtime, for example, working on Sundays. So you can see how the cost increase can be significant if they are doing it as part of their postal job as opposed to being employed directly as a temporary employee by the Census Bureau.
Yeah, I just question the efficiency of someone walking into a neighborhood they've never been in before, and they're supposed to find people, as opposed to the efficiency of a letter carrier that's been down that street, knocked on that door, been in that house 1,000 times.
You're absolutely right, and that's why if they were hired as supplemental as supplemental income, just sort of on their own, not through their postal employment, but just as anybody else. But if it was targeted recruitment, there could be both not only cost savings there, but also it could be done more efficiently.
What about reducing the number of undeliverable as addressed mailings, Mr. Thompson or Ms. Char as well? If you have any thoughts on how we go about that, or Mr. Goldenkopf.
What we were getting at there is some forms, just because the nature of the address, the Postal Service can't find the particular address, and so the using Postal Service records, for example, those can be eliminated before they get sent out.
Right.
The other thing I want to say, too, is that to the extent that there's this partnership going on, it doesn't necessarily have to be a one-way flow of benefits. The Postal Service can make use of census information to improve their operational efficiencies as well, and there's been some cases of that in 2010.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. And we are bumping up against the time we need to get to the 9/11 ceremony remembrance. I know Mr. Collins had about a minute more he wanted to take, and Ms. Norton, you walked in. Are you guys able to wait until we are done with the 9/11 remembrance on the Capitol steps, and we will reconvene then? We can't miss the 9/11 event. I believe the House members were supposed to report there at 10:45. So. But we'll give, if you guys are willing to hustle over there. So, what would you guys like to do?
I'll leave it up to you. What would you like to do?
I want to cooperate with you. I don't want to let anybody feel like they. All right, so if we'll go ahead, and Mr. Collins, if you can keep it to a minute with your closing, we'll go over and give Ms. Norton and Mr. Clay a chance.
I'm going to give a lesson. This is something, as I said a few minutes ago, is very interesting. In my office, we're going to be very involved. I want to echo the Chairman's sentiment. Think now about what you need from Congress. Think now about what you want to bring before us to change. Get it to us now so that we can have the input and we're not in a last minute or a smaller vote. That's the main thing that I would want to emphasize in our office, and my staff would be willing to work with you. Please do so. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And we'll recognize Ms. Norton now, the gentlelady from the District of Columbia.
I simply want to ask about the value or lack thereof of the community survey. Has it increased the accuracy of the census, this monthly survey? You use it as a base for the census. Does it increase the cost? Could you, if you didn't have it or if it was voluntary, would it be valuable any longer? Would it cost any less?
So thank you for the question, Congressman Norton. The American Community Survey replaced the decennial census long form to provide that valuable information. Because the American Community Survey is taken on a rolling basis, the information it provides is more current and therefore more accurate than the decennial census long form. The American Community Survey is therefore a very valuable resource for planning programs, administering programs, and it's used by a variety of stakeholders, city planners, the private sector.
Does it increase the cost significantly? If it were voluntary.
If the American Community Survey was made voluntary, I think Dr. Groves, it would increase the cost. My recollection is that Dr. Groves, in his testimony in last July, indicated that the cost might go up by as much as $60 million a year.
Has it decreased the undercount? Has it had an effect on the undercount?
The American Community Survey, since it's providing more current information, the information can be used for better planning and thus reduce the undercount to some degree. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And we will go to Mr. Clay now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'll be as brief as possible. Mr. Thompson, on March 15th of this year, I, along with several members of Congress, transmitted a letter to the Census Bureau urging the Bureau to define a national solution to ensure that incarcerated individuals are counted at their last legal residence. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision in June of 2012 upholding a Maryland law that tabulates prisoners as residents of their home addresses for the purpose of redistricting. However, since the current Census Bureau policy designates a prison cell as a residence, it prevents populations in more than 1,500 federal and state prisons that are largely male, urban, and African American or Latino from being counted as residents of their home communities. These incarcerated individuals normally have no ties to the prison location, cannot vote, and most often return to their home communities upon release. Our letter urged the Bureau to count these individuals at their last legal home address to prevent districts housing prisoners from being overrepresented. Can you share your thoughts on counting the prison population?
Congressman, at least I at the Census Bureau take the rules that we use to count individuals very seriously. After each census and before each census, the Census Bureau works with the variety of stakeholders to try to ensure that the rules they use to count people are the most appropriate for that census. And for the 2020 census, we have not made our decision yet. And my opinion on this will be based on consultations with stakeholders to try to adopt the rules that will be most appropriate to count people. So I'm looking forward to talking with you and other stakeholders about how to count not just the prison population, but of other components of our population.
And be aware that several states have implemented laws like the one upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court for Maryland that allows for you to count prisoners from their home districts. And because when you think about it, it skews the redistricting process when you count prisoners in prisons who are not there permanently. I know in my home state of Missouri, they are able to create state representative districts because of prison populations in rural areas, and it skews the entire process. So I want you to be aware of that, and I look forward to working with you and sharing our views about this issue. So, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Thompson, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I apologize. We're going to have to rush out here. We really do want to participate in the 9/11 ceremony. I'd like to thank the panel and the witnesses, and we're adjourned.